Welcome to the useless hour. Tonight, we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. Tonight, our subject is the small, soft, faintly gray knot of fluff that gathers quietly and without invitation in the human navel, the thing sometimes called navel lint or belly button fuzz, or more tenderly, navel fluff. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to do anything at all, except perhaps to breathe a little more slowly and to let the words settle over you the way the fluff itself settles, without effort, without announcement, over the course of an ordinary day. It is one of the quietest experiences a person can have. Somewhere at the end of the evening, undressing or bathing, or simply resting a hand across the middle of yourself in the dark, you discover it. A small tuft, a little bray seed of nothing, soft to the touch and lighter than you would think, and entirely mysteriously present in a place where this morning there had been nothing at all. You did not put it there. You did not feel it arrive. And yet there it is, gathered patiently through all the hours of the day, while you worked and walked and forgot entirely that it was happening. It asks nothing of you. It has no purpose. It is simply there, waiting, the way small useless things so often are, to be noticed for a moment and then let go. And we could, of course, brush it away and think no more about it. Most people across all of history have done exactly that. But tonight we are going to do the opposite. Tonight we are going to slow down and look closely and treat this small gray thing with the same unhurried seriousness that others might reserve for a cathedral or a comet or the tomb of a forgotten king. Because before we can understand why the fluff gathers, we must first sit quietly with the place where it gathers. We must consider the belly button itself. Consider then the navel. It is such a familiar thing that we scarcely see it at all. A small dimple or a small knot set roughly at the center of the body, a little hollow we have carried since before we could remember carrying anything. And yet it is, when you pause over it, one of the most remarkable marks the human body bears. For the navel is a scar. It is not a feature, not an organ, not a decoration. It is the healed record of a wound, the oldest wound each of us has, the very first mark life ever left upon us. It is the place where once we were joined to another person entirely. Before you were born, before you breathed a single breath of your own, you were connected to your mother by the umbilical cord, a soft rope of living tissue through which everything you needed simply arrived, quietly and continuously, without you ever having to ask. Through it came your food, your warmth, your very breath, delivered while you drifted in the dark and did nothing but grow. And then you were born, and the cord was no longer needed, and it was cut, and what remained slowly dried and darkened, and after some days fell gently away on its own, and the small place where it had been closed over and healed, and became the navel. That is all it is. That is all it has ever been. The first scar, the quiet monument to a connection that every single one of us once had, and every single one of us has since let go. And here is the thing that ought to keep you awake, except that tonight we would much rather it did the opposite. Almost everyone alive carries this same mark in almost exactly the same place. Kings and strangers, the people you love and the people you will never meet. Everyone who has ever lived and been born in the ordinary way, each of them marked once at the center by the same small healed wound. It is perhaps the most universal thing about the human body. Not the face, which differs endlessly, not the hands, the navel. the one small scar we very nearly all share.
They are not all quite alike, of course. Most navels, the great majority, something close to 9 in every 10, turn gently inward, forming the small, soft hollow we fondly call an innie. A smaller number turn outward instead, a little raised knot, and these we call outies, and there is nothing wrong with them at all. They are simply the rarer kind. And there is an old and stubborn belief, passed quietly from person to person for generations, that whether you became one or the other depended on the doctor or the midwife, on how carefully or how far the cord was cut. It is a tidy story. It is also not true. The cutting has nothing to do with it. Whether a navel turns in or turns out is decided by nothing more than the small private way the wound chose to heal in the days after birth, entirely on its own, while you slept and knew nothing of it. It was never anyone's doing. It simply settled, the way healing settles, into the shape it was going to keep. And it is here, in this small, healed hollow at the center of nearly every human being, that our mystery quietly lives. For this little scar, this useless soft dimple that does nothing, that serves no purpose once its one great purpose was long ago fulfilled, this quiet place somehow reliably gathers fluff. Day after day, without fail, in navels the world over, the small grey knot appears. It has done so for as long as people have worn clothes, which is to say for a very long time indeed, unremarked and uninvestigated, a tiny daily event repeated across billions of bodies and noticed by almost no one.
Almost no one. Because here is the gentle turn our hour now takes. A very small handful of people, serious people, thoughtful people, people with the patience to wonder at the things everyone else simply brushes away, have looked at this small grey knot and asked, quite sincerely, the question at the heart of tonight's slow and untroubled hour. Where does it come from? Why does it gather here and not elsewhere? Why this hollow, and why so faithfully? And they did not merely wonder, they studied it, they gathered evidence, they kept records. One of them, at the very turn of the millennium, on the far side of the world, in Australia, set out to do something almost no one in the whole history of the human body had thought to do, to ask thousands of ordinary strangers, quietly and methodically, what they had been finding all this time in their navels. But he can wait. He has waited this long. We will come to him, gently, in a little while.
Around the turn of the millennium, in the year 2001 or thereabouts, this quiet question found an unlikely champion in a man named Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki, an Australian science communicator of great and genial warmth, a person whose whole vocation was the patient explaining of the ordinary world to anyone willing to listen. And where a lesser curiosity might have shrugged and let the matter rest, Dr. Karl did something that had remarkably never quite been done before. He decided to ask, not to theorize from a single armchair, not to guess, but to gather evidence in the way that all careful science gathers evidence, by turning to the wide and various public and inviting them, gently, to look down and report what they found. And so unfolded one of the more wonderfully ordinary undertakings in the history of human inquiry. Thousands, several thousand of them, ordinary adults going about their ordinary lives, were asked to examine the contents of their own navels and to send back word of what lay within. Picture it, if you like, though you do not need to hold the image for long.
thousands of grown men and women in kitchens and bedrooms and quiet moments alone, dutifully inspecting the small hollow at the center of themselves, considering the soft gray matter gathered there, and reporting it faithfully to a scientist who genuinely wished to know. There is a great and gentle dignity in this. Thousands of strangers united across a whole continent by a single, humble question, each one a small volunteer in a survey of the overlooked. He asked them the sensible things, whether they found lint at all, how often it appeared and how much, their age and whether they were men or women, whether the skin of the belly was smooth or hairy, and whether the navel itself turned inward and inny or outward, and whether perhaps they had ever noticed anything that might explain the small daily harvest. And from this great gathering of modest testimony, patterns began to settle, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly and then unmistakably. The lint, it emerged, was far more the province of men than of women. It gathered more readily in the navels of the older than the young, accumulating, it seemed, across the long, unhurried passage of the years. And above all, it belonged to the hairy of abdomen, to those whose bellies carried a fuller growth of hair. The fuller the figure and the richer the hair, the more faithfully the fluff appeared, as though the body itself were quietly keeping a ledger. And it was the inny navel, the inward-turning kind, that made the small safe harbor in which all of it came, at last, to rest. But of all the findings that this patient survey laid gently down, one carried a quality close to wonder, a small paradox that sits at the very heart of the matter, and it is this. It did not seem to matter what color a person wore. A man might dress day after day in white, in black, in green, in red, in every shade the wardrobe could offer, and still, when he looked down at the end of the day, the fluff that had gathered was the same, a soft, muted, unassuming blue-gray, not the color of the shirt above it, not the color of anything in particular. A quiet, uniform, dusk-colored gray, arriving faithfully regardless of what had been worn to summon it, as though the navel kept its own preferences and answered to no fashion at all.
And to this gentle riddle, Dr. Karl offered a hypothesis, calm and unshowy, in keeping with the modest spirit of the whole endeavor. The work, he proposed, was being done by the hair, not by the clothing, not by the navel alone, but by the fine hairs of the abdomen, growing as they do in their own particular pattern, their own quiet spirals and sweeps across the belly. These hairs, he suggested, act as a great many tiny channels, each one loosening the smallest of fibers from the fabric worn against the skin and drawing them, hour by hour, movement by movement, inward and downward, funneling them slowly toward the central hollow, where they gather and compress into that familiar soft gray pellet. The hair harvests, the navel receives. And if this were true, then to remove the hair, to shave the belly smooth, would be to dismantle the whole gentle machinery, and the fluff would cease. A small, testable, beautifully simple idea. For this, for the survey and its patient findings, Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki was awarded, in the year 2002, an Ig Nobel Prize in the field of interdisciplinary research. And it would be easy, in a drowsier and less careful frame of mind, to mistake such a prize for mockery, but it is nothing of the kind. The Ig Nobel is a genuine honor, given with real affection to research that first makes people laugh and then makes them think. And that is precisely the shape of this work,
for you may smile at the thought of several thousand adults reporting on their own navels, and then, a moment later, find yourself genuinely wondering how it is that hair should sort color into gray, and why the body should keep such a ledger at all. The laughter and the thinking arrive together, as they were always meant to. And yet, for all its patient beauty, a survey can only ever describe the what. It can tell you who gathers the fluff and when and where it comes to rest, and it can offer, gently, a reason why. But it cannot open the fluff itself. It cannot take the small gray pellet and lay it out and ask what it is truly made of, thread by thread and particle by particle. For that, one would need a different kind of patience altogether. A person willing not merely to ask thousands of others, but to study the substance itself at close and unflinching range over a long and faithful stretch of time. And such a person, as it happens, existed, but he belongs to a later hour, and you do not need to wait up for him now. And so we come to him now, gently, in the way one approaches a man deep in his work, and the man in question is Georg Steinhauser, an Austrian chemist by profession, and not merely any kind of chemist, but a nuclear chemist, a specialist in the behavior of radioactive substances, employed in those years at the Vienna University of Technology. A man trained in the disciplines of careful measurement and the patient interrogation of very small things. He was, by every account, a serious scientist, and it was precisely this seriousness, this habit of mind that could not simply let a small mystery lie unexamined, that he turned one day, without embarrassment and without haste, upon the soft gray pellet he found gathered in his own navel.
You may picture him, if it helps you drift, at the close of an ordinary day. The lamp is low, the city is quiet outside, and this trained man, who spends his working hours among instruments of great precision, undresses in the evening and finds, as so many people find, a small tuft of fluff waiting in the hollow of his belly, and instead of brushing it away and forgetting it, as almost every human being who has ever lived has done, he pauses, he considers it, and then, with the quiet deliberateness of a scientist who has decided that a question is worth answering, he keeps it, he sets it aside, he begins, that evening, a collection. And the collection grew. Evening after evening, in the unremarkable privacy of undressing, he retrieved the little grey pellet and preserved it, and set it down and let it join the others, and this went on not for a week, not for a month, but for something close to 3 years. 3 years of quiet, faithful gathering, until in the end he had amassed 503 of them. 503 individual samples of his own navel lint, collected, kept, and catalogued, each one the residue of a single day lived inside his clothes. You do not need to remember the number, you only need to hold for a soft moment the image of a man and his patient, growing archive of fluff, tended with the same care another might give to pressed flowers or to coins. And then, having gathered them, he did what a scientist does. He weighed them. And he found each one to be a very small thing indeed, a mere fraction of a milligram, or at most a milligram or two, so light that the single breath might carry it away, so light that the whole of his 3-year labor would have weighed almost nothing at all in the palm of a hand. And he looked closer still. He asked the question that no one before had troubled to ask with such rigor, which was simply this: what is it actually made of? And the answer, when it came, was more tender than anyone might have guessed. For the fluff was not, as one might carelessly assume, merely cotton.
It was not simply a scrap of shirt. Alongside the cellulose fibers shed by the clothing, he found dead skin cells and fats and proteins and the dried residue of sweat and ordinary household dust, all of it pressed together into that one small gray body. A little compressed archive, if you like, of the person and the day they had passed through, the shirt and the skin and the labor of the body, all gathered into a single soft point. Not dirt exactly, something closer to a record.
But the deeper question, the one that had drawn him in from the beginning, was not what the fluff was, but how it came to be there at all. And here his conclusion confirmed and deepened what quieter observers had already begun to suspect, which was that the true agent, the patient laborer responsible for the whole affair, is the hair, the ordinary hair of the abdomen. He proposed the mechanism with the calm precision of his training, and it is a beautiful thing to consider as you lie still. A hair, he explained, is not smooth. Its surface is covered in tiny scales overlapping one another, like the scales of a pine cone, or like the tiles laid upon a roof. And these scales all face in one direction, all lie the same way, and so they act with every small movement of the body like a one-directional ratchet, or like the fine teeth of a rasp. The shirt shifts against the skin, the body turns in its chair, or walks, or simply breathes, and the hairs, scale by scale, catch the loose fibers of the clothing and draw them patiently, always in the one direction, walking them steadily inward across the abdomen, hour by hour, toward the low central point of the navel, where at last they gather and are held. The lint does not fall into the navel. It is carried there, escorted almost, by 1,000 tiny scaled porters over the course of a day. And how, you might wonder, drifting now, could a man be certain of such a thing? Here Steinhauser offered the most human proof of all, and the most persuasive. He shaved. He removed the hair from his own abdomen, and he waited, and he watched, and the lint stopped. It simply ceased to appear. The daily pellet, so reliable for so long, did not form. And then, in time, as the hair grew back, as the small-scaled laborers returned to their stations, the lint returned with them, faithfully, exactly as before. There is a kind of quiet triumph in that, the sort a scientist keeps to himself. The hair removed, the fluff vanished. The hair restored, the fluff returned. The case, in its small way, was closed. He noticed, too, a gentler thing along the way, which he set down with equal seriousness. That old clothing, soft and well-washed and worn thin by long acquaintance, produces less lint than clothing that is new. And the reason is plain once you hear it. New fabric is still full of loose fibers, still shedding the excess of its own making, while an old and familiar garment has already, over its years of washing and wearing, given up its loosest threads to the world, and has little left to surrender. The shirt you have loved the longest, in other words, is the one that leaves the least behind.
And so we may leave him there, Georg Steinhauser, and his 503 small grey pellets, in the honourable and unhurried service of knowledge, having answered a question that no one had asked, and asked it well. But his answer opens quietly onto a larger one. For if the hairs are only the porters, only the patient hands that carry the fibres inward, then the fibres themselves must come from somewhere. Every thread drawn into the navel was first shed by cloth, and cloth, it turns out, is always shedding, always quietly coming apart, releasing into the air and onto the skin a fine and constant snow of tiny fibers. And that snow, that endless faint unraveling of everything we wear, is a story of its own. And so we arrive at the humble origin of these threads, which is stranger and gentler than you might suppose, because it begins with a fact we rarely pause to consider, that the clothing we wear is not the solid, settled, permanent thing it appears. A shirt seems whole, a pair of trousers seems finished, complete, a single continuous object that will hold its shape until the day we decide otherwise. But this is a kindly illusion. Every garment you have ever owned is, at this very moment, very slowly coming apart. Not dramatically, not in any way you would notice from one morning to the next, but steadily, quietly, thread by invisible thread, all the time.
Consider how cloth is actually made. It is not poured or molded or grown in a single piece. It is spun. Countless short fibers, each one only a few centimeters long at most, are drawn out and twisted together into a continuous thread, and those threads are woven or knitted into the fabric that becomes the thing you button over your chest in the morning. A single cotton fiber held alone is almost nothing, a wisp, a fraction of the weight of a breath, so slight you could not feel it land upon your open palm. The strength of cloth comes not from any one fiber, but from the friction of millions of them clinging to one another, twisted and pressed together into something that behaves for a while as though it were whole. But friction cuts both ways. The very rubbing that binds the fibers also, at the loosest edges, works them free. Every movement you make asks the fabric to bend and flex and slide against itself and against your skin, and with each of these countless small motions, the fibers that were only lightly held loosen a little further, until at last they let go entirely and drift away into the air, or onto the chair, or down into the quiet hollow of the navel. You are, put gently, always shedding your clothes. Not the garments themselves, which stay obediently upon you, but the fabric of them, atom by atom, fiber by fiber, a slow and constant snowfall too fine to see. There is something almost reassuring in how small this is. No single loss matters. A shirt could shed for years and still remain, to every practical purpose, the same shirt. And here is a detail worth resting on, because it explains something you may have noticed without ever quite asking why. A new shirt sheds far more than an old and softened one. When a garment is fresh from its folding, it is crowded with loose fiber, with short ends and stray wisps left over from its making, all of them only waiting for the friction of wear to set them free. And so a new shirt gives up a great deal in its early life. But an old shirt, a favorite one, worn soft and thin over many years, has already made its peace long ago. It has, in a sense, made its peace. It has given what it had to give, and so it sheds very little now, which is precisely why the softest and most familiar clothes leave the least lint behind. Age, here, is a kind of quiet. Which brings us, at last, back to the color. You will remember the small mystery from earlier, the strange and reliable fact that navel lint, gathered from person after person, tends so often toward the same muted, unassuming blue-gray. It seemed almost like a rule, almost like magic, that so many different people should produce so nearly the same shade. But there is no magic in it, only mixture. The lint in your navel is not the offspring of a single garment. It is a blend, a mingling together of fibers freed from many different pieces of clothing, worn across many different days, the pale threads of an undershirt and the dark threads of a jumper, and the blue threads of the trousers, all of them loosened, all of them drawn to the same small place, and all of them pressed together there. And when you mix many colors, when you average them together, they do not become brighter. They trend always toward gray. That is simply what the blending of many colors does. And they lean toward blue and toward darkness besides, because blue and dark fibers are so very common in the modern wardrobe, in the denim and the navy and the charcoal and the everyday darks we reach for without thinking. The blue-gray is not a mystery. It is a portrait, in miniature, of everything you have worn.
You can see the very same phenomenon, larger and plainer, in the lint trap of a clothes dryer, that soft grey blanket of fluff that gathers with each load and must be peeled away and cleared before the next. It is precisely the same thing, only at scale. Thousands of garments' worth of loosened fiber, freed all at once by the heat and the tumbling, gathered and pressed into a single felted sheet. And there is a common belief, quietly held by many, that this drier lint is mostly dead skin. It is not. It is overwhelmingly the fabric of your clothes, the same shed fiber we have been following all along, with only some small share of skin cells and household dust folded in. What you hold when you clear the trap is mostly the clothing itself, given up a little at a time, and finally made visible. And so we return softly to the navel, and to the small mechanism we can now name plainly and without wonder as settled fact. The freed fibers drift and fall, and the hair of the belly, fine and ordinary as it is not smooth along its length, but covered in tiny directional scales, all of them tilted the same way, all of them facing inward toward the center. And with every movement of the body, every step and stretch and breath, those scales work like the smallest imaginable escalators, catching each loose thread and carrying it, patiently, always in one direction, down and inward toward the quiet hollow that waits to receive it. None of this asks to be held on to. It is happening now, gently, without you. And yet, the navel is not only a resting place for dead and drifting fiber, it is, astonishingly, also a living place, a small and warm and sheltered wilderness all its own, quietly inhabited, teeming in its own modest way with a life we are only lately beginning to understand. The navel keeps its warmth through the long hours when you are not thinking of it, and it was into that quiet, unregarded warmth that a small group of scientists once decided, with great seriousness, to look. In the year 2011, at North Carolina State University, a team of biologists gathered around an idea, led by the researcher Rob Dunn. And the idea was as simple as it was strange, which is that no one had ever really catalogued the life that lives in the human belly button. They called it, plainly and without embarrassment, the Belly Button Biodiversity Project. And they began by asking ordinary people, volunteers, to allow the small hollow of the navel to be swabbed with a gentle cotton tip, so that whatever was living there could be carried back to the laboratory, and there be coaxed into growing, and counted, and given its proper name. You may wonder why the navel of all the places on the body, and the answer is a modest and lovely one. The navel is sheltered. It is a small recess, folded and quiet, rarely scrubbed with any real attention, seldom exposed to sun or friction or the daily abrasion that scours the rest of the skin clean. It is, in the language of the ecologist, a refuge, a protected pocket where the ordinary community of the skin can settle and persist undisturbed,
the way rare and delicate things persist in the sheltered valleys of a wider landscape. And so the navel became, for these scientists, the ideal place to take the pulse of the whole quiet ecosystem that each of us carries without ever once being asked to notice it.
What they found, gathered slowly from swab after swab, was a number that has about it a certain grandeur. Across the many navels they sampled, the team identified more than 2,000 distinct kinds of bacteria. More than 2,000. Many of these were rare, appearing in only one navel or a very few, and some of them were so unfamiliar that they may well have been new to science altogether. Small living things without a name, carried unknowingly in the warm dark of an ordinary person going about an ordinary day. And yet, and here is the gentle paradox, no single person carried anything like that whole multitude. Most individuals hosted only a modest handful of kinds, a few dozen at most, so that the great total belonged not to any one of us, but to all of us together, spread thin and wide across the whole sampled crowd. There was, the scientists noticed, a pattern beneath it. A small number of hardy, common bacteria turned up in nearly everyone, faithful and familiar, and these the researchers came to call, with a touch of affection, the oligarchs, the few that reign almost everywhere. And around these few steadfast rulers gathered the great uncounted multitude of the rare, the bacteria that appeared once and then not again, the vast soft margin of diversity that made up most of the list, and yet lived in any given navel only here and there, faint as distant stars. A few held the center, the many kept to the edges. It is, when you rest with it, rather the shape of a wilderness itself. And within that wilderness there were marvels, two of which are worth carrying gently into sleep. In one navel, among the ordinary residents, the scientists found a kind of bacterium that had, until that moment, only ever been recorded in the soil of Japan, in the far earth of a country the volunteer had never once visited, never walked upon, never seen. How it came to be there in that small warm hollow, no one could quite say. And in another volunteer, a person who by their own account had not thoroughly washed in some years, the researchers found microbes of the kind that belong to the harshest places on the earth, extremophiles, the hardy survivors more usually associated with polar ice caps and the scalding vents of the deep sea, thriving there quietly against the odds in the last place anyone would have thought to look for them. You do not need to remember any of this. You need only let it settle, the strange soft fact that a person may carry, without knowing, a fragment of distant soil, or a creature bred for the ends of the earth, tucked into the fold of themselves. It becomes, the more you consider it, difficult not to think of the navel as a rainforest held in miniature, a small and private wilderness that each of us bears through every waking day, unseen and unattended, dense with life, ordered by its own quiet laws of the common and the rare, complete unto itself. Not a blemish, not a flaw, a habitat, a place where things live. And in the rarest cases, in a navel left long undisturbed, that quiet accumulation may do something stranger still. The very same materials we have followed through all these hours, the fibers and the shed skin and the soft oils of the body, the sebum and the keratin, gathering season upon season in an unwashed hollow, may slowly press together and darken and harden until they form a small firm mass, dark as a river stone, lying there in secret. It has a name, for physicians have met it before and given it the dignity of Greek. They call it an omphalythe, the navel stone, from the old word for the navel itself, and it is nothing more and nothing less than lint and skin and oil compacted by patient time into something almost mineral, a small dark stone grown from the body's own quiet forgetting. There is nothing fearful in it. It is only what happens when the gathering is never interrupted, when the small daily accumulation is simply allowed over years to go on.
And perhaps that is the strange tenderness of the whole matter, that so much can quietly assemble in a place we never think to look, a whole ecology, a fragment of far-off earth, a stone made of our own days. There are those who would ask why anyone should study such a thing at all, why a serious mind should bend itself to the fluff in a navel or the bacteria in a fold of skin. And the question deserves a gentle answer, which is that the smallest and most overlooked things have a way of holding, when we finally attend to them, a whole quiet world. The world is full of these quiet corners, and the navel is only the most personal among them. Consider first the dust that gathers beneath a bed. In almost every home there forms, in the stillest and least travelled places, a soft grey body of fluff, gathering slowly in the shadow beneath the bed, behind the wardrobe, in the corner a broom rarely reaches, along the skirting where the day's small currents of air never quite arrive. It grows where nothing disturbs it. It is, when you look closely, made of very much the same material as the small grey knot that gathers at the centre of a person, loose threads shed from clothing, fine strands of human hair, and the softer hair of a cat or a dog, ordinary dust, and the drifting lint of a household in motion, all of it drawn gently together and lightly held, until it becomes a single soft thing with its own shape. There is nothing here to hold on to. You need only to know that in the corner of a quiet room, unwatched, something soft is very slowly gathering. And this humble thing, this little grey drift of the household, has been noticed for a very long time and given names, real names, tender and strange, by people who never met one another across the reach of centuries. In English it has been called, among other things, beggar's velvet, as though the softest and most sumptuous of fabrics had settled by chance upon the poorest and most overlooked of things. It has been called house moss, as though it were a slow, silent growth of the indoors, a kind of quiet lichen of the settled home, spreading in the places where the world is left alone. Other languages have their own words, their own small affections, and in this we may notice something quietly touching, that households across history, without ever conferring, without ever agreeing, seem each to have looked into the still corner of a room and seen the little grey thing gathering there, and decided, gently, that it deserved a name. The reason these soft bodies form at all, the reason they gather where they gather and nowhere else, is a matter of stillness. Loose fibres, once they have parted from the cloth or the hair that shed them, are very light, so light that the faintest movement of air will carry them, lift them, turn them, and set them adrift across a room. Where the air moves, they move with it, and they do not settle. But every room has its quiet places, its sheltered hollows, the spaces in the lee of the world's small movements, out of the path of the opening door and the passing foot, and the warm, slow current that rises from a lamp. And it is there, in the calm, that the drifting fibres finally come to rest,
sinking softly out of the still air and settling upon one another, one thread and then another, until a small soft body begins to form. And once they have met, they are gently held. There is, in loose, dry fibers, a very faint electrical charge, the same quiet static that makes a sock cling to a shirt warm from the dryer, or lifts a fine strand of hair toward a comb. And this soft cling is enough, just enough, to hold the gathered threads loosely together, so that they do not simply scatter again at the next breath of air, but keep their shape and settle and remain. The navel, you may gently note, is precisely such a place upon the body. It is sheltered and low and protected, a small quiet hollow out of the traffic of movement, the calm eddy at the very center of a person. It is exactly the kind of still corner where the loose threads of the day would be expected to come and rest, and so faithfully, softly, they do. The same soft principle repeats itself wherever the world leaves a pocket of stillness. Consider the pocket itself, the true one, the small cloth pouch sewn into a trouser or a coat, a warm and sheltered hollow that a person carries with them through the whole of an ordinary day. Inside it, quietly, fibers gather, shed by the lining of the pocket itself, worn loose by the constant soft friction of the hand going in and out, joined by the fine debris of everything that passes through, and they drift down and settle into the seams at the bottom, into the corners where the stitching turns, and there they wait, a small grey gathering in the deepest and stillest fold of a garment, quietly assembling itself against the day it is turned out and discovered.
And there is a moment, familiar to anyone who has kept a home, when this same gentle physics slips, just briefly, out of its usual quiet order. A single paper tissue, forgotten in the pocket of a garment, goes into the wash, and there, in the warm, turning water, it softens and breaks and comes apart entirely, dissolving into 1,000 tiny loose fibers, which the machine then distributes with perfect and impartial thoroughness across every surface it can reach, until the whole load emerges dressed in a fine and even coat of pale white fluff, clinging softly to every fold. It is the same loose fiber physics as all the rest, the same shed threads and the same static cling, only for once let loose and multiplied, briefly and comically, beyond its usual gentle bounds, before it is brushed away and forgotten.
And so the pattern holds everywhere, quietly, in the corner of the room and the fold of the pocket and the drum of the machine, and at the center of a person too. The world, it seems, is full of small, sheltered hollows into which its loose ends drift and settle and are softly held, a great many quiet places where the stray threads of things come gently to rest. The navel is simply the one we carry with us, close and warm and always there, the small personal dust corner of the body, the private still place where the day's loose fibers come home. And it is perhaps no surprise, given how faithfully these little gathered things appear, and how patiently they have always waited in the still corners of our lives, that human beings should have noticed them, and wondered at them, and named them, and that in the case of this one small hollow at the center of the body, we should have gone further still, and made of it something more than fluff and stillness, something to be pondered and pictured and quietly revered.
Because a physical navel had, in earlier hours of this same slow evening, been the whole of our attention, its little knotted well, its faithful harvest of lint, it is worth following the thread outward, past the body entirely, into the strange and spacious place the navel has been made to occupy in the mind of our species. For the navel has rarely been left to lie quietly where it is. Across a great many centuries and a great many peoples, it has been asked to stand for something far larger than itself, to mean things it could not possibly have arranged to mean, and it has borne this weight as it bears everything, in silence. Consider first and most grandly the idea of the navel as a center. The ancient Greeks had a word for the navel, and the word was omphalos, and it is a soft and rounded word, a word that seems to close gently upon itself as you say it. And at the sanctuary of Delphi, among the most sacred of all the sacred places of the Greek world, there stood a stone, a rounded and carven stone, and this stone was called the omphalos, the navel. It was held to mark not the navel of any one person, but the navel of the whole world, the very center, the middle point of all the earth, the place where everything was reckoned to begin. You may let that settle for a moment, unhurried, the notion that the world should have a middle at all, and that the middle should be marked, and that the mark should be shaped of all the shapes there are, like the small dimple at the front of a human belly. It is a very old habit of thought, and a very natural one, and the Greeks were not alone in it. Many peoples, in many parts of the world, have named some sacred place the navel of the world, some central and originating point from which all else was felt to unfold. And it is not difficult to see how the metaphor arrived, how it made its patient way from the body to the map. The navel is where each of us was joined to our beginning. It sits more or less at the middle of us, and so the middle of the body became, by the oldest and gentlest of leaps, a way of speaking about the middle of everything, the center, the origin, the still point around which the rest is arranged. And then there is the matter of looking at it. There is a real word, a genuine and serviceable word, for the contemplation of one's own navel as an aid to meditation, and the word is omphaloskepsis. It means quite precisely navel-gazing, though it means it in the reverent register, the register of the cloister and the long silence. For this was, in truth, a spiritual discipline, or was bound up with one. Among certain contemplative monks of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the hesychasts of Mount Athos, who sought a great inward stillness through a slow and repeated prayer, there was associated a manner of praying in which the gaze was lowered, drawn down toward the middle of the body, toward the navel, as a way of gathering the scattered attention inward and settling the restless mind into quiet. Their critics found this exceedingly easy to mock, and mock it they did, and the mockery has, in a sense, outlived the practice, for the phrase navel-gazing has come down to us as a byword for the most useless kind of self-absorption, the fussing over one's own small concerns while the world goes on without one. And yet, at its root, it was something earnest and demanding, a real attempt to still the whole clamoring self by fixing the eye upon the quietest, most modest point it could find. There is something rather fitting on a channel such as this one in remembering that navel-gazing was once a serious thing.
And then, strangest of all, there is the theology. There is a question, and it is a real question, one that was genuinely and seriously debated across a great span of years, and the question is whether the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, would have had navels at all. For a navel is a scar. It is the mark left behind by a cord, the sign that one was once joined to a mother and then parted from her, the small memorial of having been born. But the first two, in the old account, were not born. They were made directly,
whole and adult, joined to no mother, parted from no cord. And so the reasoning went, they ought to have had no navels, no need of one, no reason for that little knot to exist upon their bodies at all. It was a genuine puzzle, and it troubled thoughtful people, and it left its faint mark upon art, for the painters across the centuries, tending to their brushes and their careful flesh, quietly gave the first couple navels anyway, as though they could not quite bring themselves to paint a person without one. And in the year 1857, an English naturalist by the name of Philip Henry Gosse, a serious and devout and gifted observer of the natural world, published a book, and he gave it the title Omphalos, which is to say, the navel. And in it he set out an elaborate and painstaking theory meant to untie such knots as this one. It was received poorly, it pleased almost no one, and it is remembered now, when it is remembered at all, chiefly as a magnificent and heartfelt failure, the earnest labor of a good and careful mind that the world simply could not bring itself to accept.
And so here is what has happened to this small and useless scar. It has been made the center of the world. It has been made a place of prayer, a threshold of stillness for men who gave their whole lives to silence. It has been made a knot of theology, grave enough to occupy the learned for generations, and to gather a book around itself, and to defeat that book. This is a great deal to ask of a fold of tissue that spends nearly all of its long career doing nothing whatever but quietly collecting fluff. You need remember none of it, but perhaps, drifting here in the low light, you may notice the shape of the thing, the way the human mind, given even the smallest and most idle object, cannot seem to leave it plain. We attend to little things. We cannot help it. We take the modest and the overlooked, the scar, the stone, the dimple, and we turn them slowly in the hand of the mind until they hold a meaning, or if not a meaning, then at least our attention, which is perhaps the same gift by another name.
And so we arrive without hurry at the far edge of the evening's small findings, settle around us like dust, returning slowly to a windowsill. Consider for a moment all that we have quietly witnessed. A survey conducted among thousands of strangers who agreed, with the seriousness that ought to move us, to speak of the contents of their own navels. A chemist who gathered over the patient span of 3 years 503 separate pieces of his own navel fluff, and kept them, and weighed them, and thought about them. A team of biologists who bent their considerable training toward the human belly button and found there a wilderness of bacteria, a teeming and unmapped country no wider than a coin, home to life forms that had never before been named. These were serious people, applying serious methods to a subject the rest of the world had agreed, without ever quite deciding to, simply not to look at. And there is a kind of dignity in that which is worth resting with as the night deepens. For the world is full of things no one has bothered to examine, not because they are hidden, but because they are humble, because they sit too close to us, too far beneath notice, too small to seem to deserve the effort of a mind. To turn toward such a thing anyway, deliberately, and to ask of it the plain and honest questions, how much, and how often, and why, and to write down the answers with care, is not foolishness. It is one of the purest forms of attention a person can offer the world. It asks for nothing in return. It expects no reward, no application, no use. It simply says, here is a thing that is real, and no one has looked at it properly, and I will. There is even a prize for such attention, given each year, quietly celebrated, to research that first makes you laugh and then makes you think. And that small phrase holds more than it seems to,
for it names a truth that runs quietly through the whole long history of curiosity, that the two are not opposites, the laughter and the thinking, but companions, arriving one after the other, the smile making room for the thought that follows it. A question may seem trivial at the doorway and open once you have stepped through onto something real, onto the workings of the body, or the behavior of small fibers, or the invisible life that shares our skin. And sometimes it opens onto nothing further at all. Sometimes the question is answered, and the answer is simply the answer, complete in itself, useful to no one, and that is fine. Both of these are fine. The understanding that widens outward, and the small fact that stays exactly its own size. Neither owes the world anything more than the pleasure of having been noticed.
And so we come back gently now to where we began, to the small grey pellet resting in the hollow of the navel at the end of an ordinary day. It seems different now, does it not, than it did at the start of the hour? It is no longer only a thing to be brushed away and forgotten. It is a small daily gift of no use whatsoever, gathered without your knowing, assembled thread by thread from everything you wore and everything you did, drawn inward by the quiet friction of the day. A portrait of the hours you passed through, the blue of a favorite shirt, the gray of an old one, the soft debris of walking and sitting and reaching and resting, all of it migrating slowly, patiently toward that one small center and settling there and waiting to be found. A day quietly assembled, and then, without ceremony, quietly let go. You need not remember any of this. That is perhaps the gentlest truth of the whole evening. None of it was meant to be kept. You may let every fact of it loosen and drift and fall away from you like fibers from worn cloth. The number and the names, the chemist and his careful jar, the coin-wide wilderness and the thousands of patient strangers, all of it slipping softly out of reach as you sink further down. It was never yours to hold. It was only ever yours to rest beside for a little while, here in the quiet before sleep. So let it go now. Let the numbers soften. Let the names blur and grow warm and formless. Let the small grey pellet in the navel be the last small thing your mind touches, unremarkable, harmless, complete. And then let even that dissolve. There is nothing here that needs you, nothing to solve, nothing to carry, nothing to finish. The findings are gathered, the strangers have gone home, the jar is sealed, the tiny wilderness turns on without us in the dark. And you may simply lie still and grow heavier and breathe more slowly and let the quiet close over you like water settling after the last small stone has sunk. Rest now. There is nothing more to know tonight. The useless and the beautiful have kept you company for an hour and asked nothing, and now they too grow quiet and dim and still. Good night. And when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting.